story is called St. Patrick and the Peddler, a Celtic tale. There was once a peddler who lived in the north of Ireland, in a wee little town called Ballymena. It was near the sea. Now this peddler lived in a wee hut made of stone, and he lived there and was very happy. He spent most of his time out on the road. He sold small things that made people's lives better. Needles, pins, thread, buttons, bits of mirror, pieces of paper, and stubs of pencils. He walked the roads round about Ballymena, crisscrossing the land, selling those things to folks. Now, whenever he came home, he would go into his stone hut and he would pull out his great kettle and he would fill it and cook his meals. Now, the children of the village of Ballymena loved the peddler because he loved to tell stories of the most famous person who had ever lived in their wee town, St. Patrick himself. The children would come and sit around the peddler's fire and listen to the stories. He had a special friend, a little boy named Daniel, who often came. He always had questions. One day, the peddler had just pulled his pot out and he was filling it with water and oatmeal to make a meal for himself. And the little boy, Daniel, came in and said, "Oh, look at your pot. Your pot has writing round the edge." "Aye," said the peddler, "you're right. Do you know what those words mean?" "I don't know," said the peddler. "This might have been a pot that St. Patrick himself used. He might have even lived in a hut like this, but I don't know for sure." "How can you find out what those words mean?" "Well, you could go to the priest," said the peddler. "They will teach you to read. And then, would you come back and tell me what my pot says?" "Aye, of course," said Daniel. Well, the days went by and the peddler sold his goods and bought more, until one terrible day in 1845, all over the land of Ireland, potato plants began to die. They turned to green and black slime in the earth, and everywhere people began to starve. The extra bits of money that they had saved, they now needed to buy food. So one by one, people had less money to buy the bits and bobs that the peddler had to sell. Days went by and he collected less and less money and came home with a much fuller pack than he should have. One day, he came back from trying to sell things without having sold one needle, not one mirror, nothing. Well, his own money, his own savings were so low that all he had left was one last serving of oatmeal. So he thought, well, I'll make my meal tonight and I'll eat it. And so he did. In fact, there was only 1 cup of oatmeal left, hardly enough for a grown man like himself. But he cooked it and he ate it, and then he went to bed. He was hungry, he was tired, he was worried. He tossed and turned on his bed for hours. Finally, late in the night, he had a dream. He dreamt that St. Patrick himself stood in the doorway of his little stone hut. He stood in his long bishop's robe and his tall mitre, the bishop's cap. In one hand, he held the bishop's staff, and he spoke to the peddler. "Peddler of Ballymena," he said, "arise from your bed. Go to the great city of Dublin, far to the south. Stand on the bridge that crosses the Liffey River, and there you shall hear what you must hear." Well, the peddler woke up the next morning remembering the dream, but he shook at his head. How could I possibly leave? How could I travel so far? It's just a dream. Well, that next morning, he scraped the remains of his oatmeal dinner from the pot, ate what little there was, and set off along the roads again, hoping against hope that there would be someone who would have money to buy some of his small things. He crisscrossed the county, but when he returned that night, he had sold nothing. He had nothing to eat, and so he went to bed. He tossed and turned, his empty stomach rolled and rumbled and kept him awake late into the night. Early in the morning, he had that dream again, but this time, St. Patrick stood in the middle of his room, and his voice was louder, not like the wind through the grasses, but loud as the night birds call. "Peddler of Ballymena, arise from your bed. Go to the great city of Dublin, far to the south. Stand on the bridge that crosses the Liffey River, and you shall hear what you must hear." Well, the peddler again woke up, wondering about the dream that he had had. How can I go? How can I leave? It's impossible. The next day, he left the house with no hope, but trying one last time. He walked slowly. He was so tired and hungry. And as the sun set, he returned home, once again having sold nothing. The pot was empty. All the crusts of oatmeal were gone. He thought, well, at least if I am to die, they will find me clean. And so he went to the well and collected a bucket of water. He washed his face and hands, drank a cup of water, and laid down on his bed. He was so restless, so hungry, so tired. He tossed and turned through the night. Finally, long after midnight, he began to dream. There was St. Patrick, and he stood now right beside the peddler's bed. He stamped the bottom of his shepherd's crook onto the stone floor of the peddler's hut. "Peddler of Ballymena, rise from your bed. Go to the great city of Dublin, far to the south. Stand on the bridge that crosses the Liffey River, and there you shall hear what you must hear." Well, the peddler jumped out of bed, grabbed his pack, flew out the door of the stone hut, and headed south as fast as he could. Along the roads he traveled day after day, he walked as fast as he could. After many days, he reached the great city of Dublin. Just as the sun was rising and sparkling all the rainbow windows of the town, he made his way to the river and walked onto the bridge. It was early, but many people were already coming and going. The peddler stood in the middle of the bridge. He stood on one side and leaned up against the railing. He watched, he looked into people's faces, hoping that someone would approach him, but no one did. From time to time, he would cross to the other side of the bridge and stand there for a time to see if that made any difference at all. But the day went by and no one spoke to him. No one even looked at him. Well, as the sun began to go down, someone, a man from across the street, came out of his shop. It was a butcher. He was wiping his hands on his bloody apron, and he came right toward the peddler. He walked right up to him and said, "Are you all right? Is there something wrong? Are you waiting for someone?" "Oh, I don't know," said the peddler. "I've watched you all day," said the butcher. "I know. I had this dream." "Oh, dreams," said the butcher. "I know about dreams. For the last 3 nights, I have had a dream. St. Patrick has appeared to me. He has said that I must travel far to the north to a tiny town called Ballymena, and I must find a wee stone hut and dig in the floor. And there I will find what I must find." Now, can you imagine? I can't possibly leave my shop and travel so far. Oh, dreams, they're useless. And the butcher turned and walked back to his shop. The peddler stood for a moment, and then he too hurried off the bridge and headed north as fast as he could. Day after day, he traveled back up those roads until after many days, he reached his tiny hut there in the tiny town of Ballymena. He went to the pot hanging in his fireplace. He unhooked it from that great hook in the top of the fireplace and set it on the floor. Then he grabbed his spade and began to loosen the stones that lined the bottom of the fireplace. When he had cleared them away, he began to dig and dig and dig. Finally, ching! His spade hit something. And he took his hands, and in the dirt, he could feel a round outline. He continued to dig until he was able to loosen a pot, another pot, very similar to his own cooking pot. And just as he bent down and picked that old pot up from the pit and set it on his floor, the little boy Daniel came in. He said, "Oh, Peddler, what have you found?" "I have found what Patrick promised me." "Really?" said Daniel. "And I have found what you promised me. I went to the priests and they taught me to read. And I can read the words around your old cooking pot now." "Please do," said the peddler. "Those words say, 'Beneath me lies another pot, even better.'" Well, that old pot from the ground was filled with gold, ancient gold, coins and rings and jewels. And the peddler used that money to help all his friends and neighbors. He bought them food and clothing, and they got through those hard times together. And he had enough money to find himself a wife and a new house. But he never forgot how important St. Patrick was. And at the end of every day, all the children of the village would gather in the peddler's house. And the peddler would say, "I, St. Patrick, might have lived right here in a hut just like this. He might have cooked in a pot like this." And Patrick has blessings for all of us. 1,000 blessings. And that's the St. Patrick and the Peddler.